Hi, everybody. I feel like it's really great to see so many familiar faces. Thank you all for coming. My name is Mindy Dubansky, and welcome to our lecture by Alexandra Soteriou on the Indo-Islamic papermaking heritage. And I'm going to just tell you that this lecture has been sponsored by 3 departments: the Thomas J. Watson Library, the Department of Islamic Art, and the Sherman Fairchild Center for Paper Conservation for works of art on paper. And I'm going to introduce Jana Van Dyke to you. Jana and I collaborated on planning this lecture, and Jana is a conservator in the Sherman Fairchild Center for the Conservation of Works on Paper. She's treated all the collection, the Metropolitan's collection of Deccan art, and has been the paper conservation coordinator for the Sultans of Deccan India exhibition, which has been 5 years in the planning. And you might be interested in knowing that there are over 100 works of art on paper in the exhibition, and a lot of these objects, if you see in the exhibition, you can see it involved a lot of custom framing and custom matting and a lot of conservation treatment, all of which Jana oversaw. Jana has been a speaker at the recent symposium, Deccan Painting Through the Lens, and spoke about the materials and unique techniques employed by Deccan Indian artists. She has written blogs on marbled paper, along with a technical essay on the Bodleian painter, and is represented on the audio guide for the exhibition. And in terms of a plug for the Thomas J. Watson Library, I'd like to tell you that the library has been very actively collecting books on the history of papermaking and the book arts, and all of you are welcome to use the library, and you can all get your library registration through the internet, and we welcome you and hope to see you there. Here's Jana Van Dyke.
Thank you so much, Mindell. It's such a great pleasure to be with you all today and introduce our speaker, Alexandra. And a 1984 Fulbright grant to explore Indian papermaking heritage inspired Alexandra's subsequent 3 decades of involvement with multifaceted aspects of hand papermaking, including in-depth field work in India, Pakistan, Nepal, Uzbekistan, and Thailand. She has worked with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the United States Agency for International Development, and Aid to Artisans. Her book, Gift of the Conquerors, Hand Papermaking in India, was awarded the Gold Medal Outstanding Academic Book in 1999 by the Association of College Research Libraries and remains a recognized treasure. And we have copies of Alexandra's book up front and are for sale. And recently, Alexandra received a grant from the Islamic Manuscript Association to categorize and prioritize her 20,000 slide archive about the heritage of paper from Indo-Islamic lands. The 500 most important will be digitized with metadata, and the archive will be donated to the University of Iowa Center for the Book, with the stipulation that the images will be made freely available on the website. Prior to her work with papermakers abroad, Soteriou underwent years of formal apprenticeships and lessons in hand papermaking, bookbinding, and restoration, including an apprenticeship with master papermaker Douglas Howell, an apprenticeship at the Center for the Book Arts in New York, and lessons with Deborah Evitz of the Pierpont Morgan Library. She has owned a small paper mill and bookbindery in New Jersey, has lectured widely, written about paper, exhibited and curated paper exhibitions, and has been awarded grants from the New York State Council of the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the New Jersey State Council of the Arts. Please now join me in warmly welcoming to the podium Alexandra Soteriou.
Thank you, Jana, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon. What I'm going to be sharing with you this afternoon, just to give you a sense of where we're going, we're going to look at the migrations along with the Mughals and the Sultans of these hand paper makers into India primarily, And we're going to look at the way they made paper and how they did it, and then understand a little more how the techniques and the methods impacted the look of paper, the different papers that we see in art and manuscripts. You'll have a lot more clarity on that. And then finally, a little bit of a look at some of the artistic expressions on those papers. And I want to just lay blame before I begin. However, my background in college was in applied anthropology, which really did come into play doing these many years of field work. I have to lay the blame on a rare book dealer who gave me a copy of this book on papermaking in India. Also, the Center for Book Arts, where I ended up meeting Douglas Howell and apprenticed in papermaking. And then finally a friend that led me to the Fulbright organization, which granted me my trip to India to do research, my first trip there. And then lastly, it was the elder papermakers who I met, who you'll see, who really persuaded me that I needed to document their history and heritage. Okay. And we're going to start looking at this wonderful image from the India Office Library from the 1800s on the left side of the screen. And that is a really compact picture of the way paper was made. And I'm just going to highlight for you a little bit. Up on the top area here, you have the water wheel, and it's got a stamper and a pounder. Oops, I covered it. It's hitting a rock, and the fiber is placed on top of that rock, and it's pounded. And you see there's a stream that runs by, and here the artisans are making paper, washing the pulp in this cloth tied to their waists, and above them you see this little cake-like pounded bunch of pulp and the little container for pulp. And this is then brought to the villagers, and they make the sheets out of it. And here you can see a villager squatting in front of a pit that goes into the earth, and he's got in his hand a mold that he's dipping into that vat with the pulp in it. And this is a way that paper was made in Central Asia, in Samarkand, and in China. So the way of doing it, as well as the individuals who came into India to do it, followed a migration path that came along with the Mughals, with the Sultans. You'll see more. And then we have some paper sheets drying on the top. Here is a slant board with a polisher to polish the paper sheets so that the surface could be smooth for calligraphy and for holding art. And on the bottom is a mold and paper being pressed, a little hair brush for sizing the paper, and a well there. And on the right is one of these elders I met in Gosundra. When I first went to India, and everybody said to me, there's nothing left, it's all gone. And I have to tell you, of course, after Gandhi's time, there was the village industries and Gandhi's movement to have hand paper making as part of the village activity. And that was a Western-style paper making. And in Sri Aurobindo, you all remember seeing those marbled incense covers, and they do paper for watercolor. That's not what I'm going to focus on. This is really a look at the old traditions and the way paper was made for hundreds of years that formed the base for the miniature paintings, for the wonderful manuscripts, for the marbled images. And we're going to look at the lineage, and let's see. Let me see if I get this to work. Whoops. All right. And so when I hit the ground, and how in a country as big as India could I find things? So I had a number of clues that led me to be able to create this understanding of the heritage of this craft. And one of the things is that paper was traditionally made by Muslim families, and the activity was kept within the family for generation after generation. So these families could have been making paper, in many instances, 600 years, generation after generation. Were trained in the family. The young son would learn what the father taught. But the best part was their last names. They kept the last name Kagzi, from the Persian Kagid, for paper. So that was my clue. I'd go into Mathura, or a town of many hundreds of thousands of people, and I'd search out people with the last name Kagzi. And then the other thing I used as my tool to form this history and to get a better handle on it was that I went to towns that were great centers of art during Mughal times, during the Sultan times, and I looked for clues where great works of art came out, because I knew they had to have paper, of course. And then I also followed the rivers and water sources looking for the ruins. So these were my lead-in on this very incredible journey. And here on the left, you see one of the Kagzi, the older villager, and he's got on the outside of that structure there is the icing that the village huts had that allowed paper sheets to dry on the side of the building and sun dry. And they're very shiny and smooth sheets. We'll see more. Okay. So what I want to clearly show is that the families of Kagzis that I spoke with really created, filled in the vacuum. We knew about paper making in China a lot. We know about the great paper making in Samarkand, but we didn't know so much about the history in India. And these Kagzi family members traced their ancestry back to Samarkand, to Afghanistan, to Bokhara, to Balkh, and then in through Kashmir in northern India and down into the heartland of India. Some came, traced their family to come in during Babur's time. Some came through the Sultanate, Tughlaq. Some came through Delhi, but you can see the lineage there. Kashmir, Sialkot in Pakistan, Taljara, and into Sanganer, which is outside of Jaipur, which has, for many years, was a center of paper making. And concurrently, the writings of the Mughals very often referred to paper. And here we see a note from Babur, the connoisseur, from his diaries, connoisseur of everything from melons to poetry, and he says that the best paper in the world comes from Samarkand, and he describes it, and he talks about watching it being made there. So these are the routes that these families migrated into India from. And here are some of the faces of these elder Kagzi paper makers. And they weren't making paper, most of them. Some were not making paper when I arrived, but they were able to give me a lot of oral tradition that hadn't been recorded. And so that was wonderful. The guy in the middle is from the Faragana Valley and just down from Samarkand, and he knew of members of his family that had migrated into India. So these are what the faces of these old guys look like, and they were what sort of set me on the path or the trail. And so not only their great recollections of family migration, knowing where their family had lived 500 years ago, where they moved when there was a flood, where they moved when there was a famine, but also, besides their oral tradition documenting this, we have the castes, the local villagers, where there's a caste that's in charge of documenting the lineage of individuals in that village. And so a lot of the material I gathered orally was also corroborated by these village genealogists. And so, and this really, here we are really stepping into Deccan territory right away. These are the villages right outside of Daultabad that were the source of the paper that was used in much of the Deccan. Anyway, in this area here, I'm pretty sure this is in Arundel. This is what I first found when I stepped on ground. You see the Cogsey on the left. He's standing next to one of those pit vats, and on the one side is a fermenting well. And then in the background are these giant chabutra tables, which were used to bleach the hemp and the recycled paper for use again. And he's pointing out another one of these pit vats, and these are very similar to what is in Uzbekistan and going right to some of the Chinese remains from papermaking. So here you see on the left, these are fermenting pits where the pulp, the fibers are allowed to soak so they break down a bit. And those are fermenting pits alongside of the giant tables, these giant tables for bleaching fiber. So you can imagine the production of sheets, if they've got platforms like that all over, used for bleaching, preparing the fiber. So they were really whaling, making paper. And these are looking like 1800s, probably 1700s too. And I just wanted to include a teeny look in the north because, you know, a lot of this migration came through Kashmir. And I went up into the mountains of Gilgit and Hunza looking to see if there was any birch bark paper still. And I found some outside of a tea stall on one of the highways in a nameless village. And you see the manuscript on the right, British Library manuscript that was done on birch bark. Not an easy restoration project there, for sure. But in any event, so when I was up in Hunza and Gilgit, I saw that this bark was still used for talismans that are worn around the neck and for amulets, things that are considered sacred, but also to line the roofs of the buildings and to preserve butter and stick the butter underground, so wrapped in this birch bark so it would survive. And the sad story up here, because I was high in the mountains and there was no one around but a few German anthropologists, and you saw all the Buddhist caves in the mountains, and I was told that the villagers would take the scrolls from the caves and use them to insulate their roofs. So just one of the many recyclings that takes place that changes what we have left today. So here are some of the raw materials that make the basis for the beautiful papers out of India, and primarily jute and hemp, sometimes flax, flax was used more in Samarkand, but jute and hemp. And you see on the left, outside a traditional papermaker's hut, the plant fibers still have the bark on them, and they're drying. And then they take that chaff or that bark off, and you see this man's showing the beautiful, strong inner fiber that creates beautiful paper. And on the right, you see after it's been cleaned and washed, it has the consistency of a golden hair, and it's a beautiful, luminous color, and it really gives character to the paper, this glorious golden. And here, these were in a couple of villages outside of Aurangabad and Kanpur, where women straddled an upright blade between their legs, and they're cutting cloth rags. And these are rags that are left from garment manufacture today, but in past, of course, they were just general rags. And couple things here. In these Muslim family communities, there was a really kind of strict delegation of who did what in the paper making. The women cut the rags, they polished the paper, and the men were always the sheet makers. And one theory, well, okay, let's don't want to add fire to theories. So here's a close-up which will help illustrate the role that fiber plays in paper and how we beat it and how we prepare it, how it creates a different type paper. The paper on the left, you can see the fibers have been, they're still very apparent, and they may be probably jute or hemp. They're very, very apparent. There may be some rag in there as well, but you can tell the fiber hasn't been beaten so well, and it still has its original character, whereas the paper on the right is almost like transparent. Yes, it's highly polished, but it's also, the pulp has been beaten and beaten, so you don't have all these lengthy fibers, and it's almost like a cellophane. And the longer the paper is beaten, the harder crisper it feels. The least beating, it feels soft. And so you have not only the transparency and the crispness, but how it feels there and the shine. Okay, so in India, on the top, see these guys are holding, this is 1800s, they're holding onto a balancing cord while they're operating with their feet these trip hammers, which go down to the vat there, and there's a rock on the bottom of the vat with an indentation in it. And that poor guy in the vat, and there's 3 of them over there, is pushing the pulp under that trip hammer while these guys are operating it. And they did have songs. I never heard the songs, but you can imagine like the rowers on a boat that have a very monotonous task. They were singing sometimes while they did this, and I just can imagine the guy on the bottom there getting his hands knocked around, and it just doesn't seem like the most productive way to beat pulp, and I don't know why, but this is the way it was done in India, whereas in Central Asia there were the big mills where you had many trip hammers that were water powered. This is from the Fergana Valley. I found a mill that was still there, not making paper though, of course, from the 1800s in Uzbekistan on the right. And another thing I found all over were these denki holes, which are on the left. You see this stone with all these little holes in it. And those holes were what held the pivot of that trip hammer. So although the wooden trip hammers were gone, these were the stones that told me that they had made paper here. And in the center is a modern version that Khadi and Village Industries made of a foot-operated trip hammer for beating pulp. That's a Western beater by comparison. And one of the things I found in the very old places of making paper, they had these floors that were structured with raised and lowered patterns in, and they used this for breaking up manuscripts and paper to recycle it. And so once again, we have this endless recycling going on, and this was done in 1800s. I don't know, I suppose also in the 17s, and so we don't know, of course, what has been lost through recycling. But just to give you a flavor, one of these elder Kagsis who I met, who was still making traditional paper, under his home or his hut were hundreds of old books that he was breaking up and reusing for pulping. And it was only about an 8-inch opening, so I couldn't crawl under there and save heavens knows what. But it's an example of how things were always changing and being recycled. And here are some of the pits on the left. Here you can see fibers and rags and whatever they're going to use for paper making, which is being fermented. And then in the right here you can see they're foot stomping it, just the way you would foot stomp grapes maybe, breaking down the fiber, and That's another way it was prepared. And here you see on the left, and this is 1800s on the left, you see all those, they look like loaves of bread up in the top, but these are those compacted rounds full of pulp that are given to the local sheet makers. And here they are washing the way they did many years ago with the cloth around their waist up on the top. Actually, on the top right, this is in Kuldabad, which is right outside of Daulatabad, and it was the area that made paper for the Deccan. But they've got a faucet now instead of using the river, and then in another area, they're using the town well here to wash the pulp. And in Sanganeri, you can see they're still doing the same way they used to do it years ago, washing it with the cloth around the waist, and then squeezing the water out here. Their guy has got that, making that round ball here by squeezing the water out and pushing this guy's head. And then here you see the villager carrying the pulp to the paper maker. And this is really very typical. This is a real village activity. Has been. And now, how do they get those interesting sheets that are really signature sheets for India? And the molds end up being the clue when you're doing restoration to some levels of where the paper came from. We'll take a look at that. And they're called chapri in India. And they were using the grass reeds that grow alongside the rivers. And, of course, they're cleaned and dried. And then they're woven on a loom. And again, the women, and these are only traditionally done only in the Muslim families. And the picture in the upper left is in Lahore, just showing how that same way of weaving fiber is used in everyday life. They're for blinds and mats, the same kind of thing. They weave the fibers across, and those are little terracotta weights that keep the threads, the tension on the threads. But there's a lot of art to this because the reeds are not long enough for the mold. The molds are usually around 30 inches. And so they have really this great art. They have a little skinnier piece of fiber, of reed that acts as a peg in between the ends of, here you have an end, so they're pegged together so that none of those reeds move. They form a solid line, so it's very artful. And this is the current reeds that they're using, but I have seen molds or chapri, and you can see in the watermark of some older papers, very, very fine. They're almost the size of a hair. Reeds were used, and you see the beautiful flecks in this, and this is a wooden frame here that the mold rests on, and sidebars that hold the water from running off on the side. You'll see in a minute. Now I just want to show how the character of the mold impacts the paper. So on the left, and this was made by a student in Iowa, so you can see the marks left, almost like a watermark from the reed chapri. And so you can see whether the reed is fine or if there's any characteristics. Like, for example, in British Library recently, we had a presenter who showed that the Andalusian papers had a special way of tying the fibers. So right away when you saw that watermark, you knew the paper, where it was from. So that this is a way to begin to identify. But one other thing I want to show you about this sheet. You see in the center there's a kind of clumping of fibers. It's not uniformly distributed, and this was done by a student. The master paper makers, when you have those very beautiful sheets out of India, you wouldn't see this clumping. It would be just a uniform, beautiful, beautiful sheet. And just by way of contrast, the sheet on the right, using a Western wire mold, you see the watermarking there. Okay, so, and here we are in Gosundra, which is, Deccan. This man is squatting on his haunches, and he's got to dip this mold into a vat beneath him and bring it up against the weight of hundreds of pounds of weight of water and create a sheet really fast. It's quite a skill. This is not, it's not something that is easy to do. And one of the places, and this fits right into the Deccan exhibit here, that I explored was Daultabad Fort, and because paper, Tughlaq had paper makers up there making paper, and it was said that from the fort, in the villages around the fort, were the suppliers of paper for the Deccan. So I spent many hours climbing up this fort, and very, very narrow ways. It's a really tricky journey. Anyway, I did find Denki pivot remains and vats, but the story goes that one of the Sultan's girlfriends didn't like the sound of pounding the pulp, so that's why they took it out of the fort. And there are 3 villages right around here that I went to, Arundel and Kuldabad and Kagsipura, where the paper makers were expelled to do their noisy and stinky craft and supply paper for that beautiful art that was to come. And on the right side, here is a traditional workplace. In one of these places, I think this is Kagsipura, right outside of this fort. And you see here is a pit the paper maker would stand in, and there's his mold. You'll see in a minute a little more. And so Ramuddin Kagzi is the paper maker on the left, and he's standing on the pit, and he's stirring those fibers so that you don't see that clumpy sheet, so that the sheet he makes is really uniform. And here you see also, by contrast, not standing in the pit but squatting in front of it, is a young, relatively young paper maker in Sanganer. He's floating that mold, he's organizing his fibers, and this post of paper on his left was the number of sheets he made in a morning. This young man was really fast. There are about 200 or so sheets there. These guys are amazing. And then this was in one of the huts in this old area, these old villages, and there's no light, so my photographs are very difficult, only the light through the window. And you see they're using this jug to organize the fibers so they can create those beautiful even sheets. And here you have, again, the guy on the left squatting, dipping that beautiful big mold into the vat, and Ramuddin on the right doing the same thing from a standing position. And here's Ramuddin again. He's got the first dip in his sheet, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's a wave of a second dip. And so what he's done is he's organized a very thin sheet, and then he's dipped in again, and it's called Dopani Kagaz, and it was the skill of the really great paper makers. And by doing that, they created really, really strong sheets that would stand up to stone polishing and burnishing. And here you see on the right, he's bringing up his mold, and it's going to be put onto this stack. You'll see how that happens. Oh, and before that, I wanted to just show you a couple side views of people in position making paper. And this is hard for those of us who have been paper makers to really get a handle on, because we stand and the vat is right by our waist, and it's back-breaking, but not like this. And this is a real stretch, and they are making 500 to 1,000 sheets in a day. Usually the masters, so they said around 500 sheets. But even on the right, you see an elder still making paper. Okay, and so back to Ramuddin again. His helper on the opposite him is placing a thin cloth on that sheet, and then Ramaddin is then taking that and releasing it onto a stack of papers here that have an interleaving of cloth. And the old masters did not use, most of them did not use even an interleaving. They posted all the wet sheets that feel like dough. They're very fragile. And certainly the thinner and the more translucent, you can imagine how fragile they are. And they put one atop another without the interleaving. And so this is how skilled they were. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, and so here you see his associate lifting them to loft dry, and then after they've dried, they've been pressed a bit. Now here is the guy that had all those manuscripts stashed under his house in Sanganer. His wife is taking a post with fresh dough sheets that have nothing in between them. She's removing one by one, and she's brushing them on these specially coated plaster walls. And you can see the wet sheet is kind of a light tan, and then when it dries, it turns to white. And so what happens is that plaster wall forms a very mirror-like surface on the back of the sheet. So if you see a sheet in a manuscript or something where one side is very smooth and the other may have a little more texture to it, you know it was wall dried as opposed to being pressed and hung on a line to dry. She's got a pretty rugged brush there. And here you see the sun has dried those sheets. They're white. And she's removing them. They pop right off the wall. And you can see the impressions from years and years and years of those walls being used to dry paper. But now we've also got another clue to looking at paper's identity and understanding how it was made. On the right, you see the brush marks that are left from the way she brushed that paper onto the wall. So not only do we have the back marks from the reeds and the chapri, but you'll also see old papers that have these brush marks, various. And each artist had a different way, a different way they'd brush things. And so you could it's almost like a signature. You almost get an identity when you can start to see some correlation between sheets sometimes. And so here you have on the left in Kalpi, and Kalpi was also was the governor under governor. It was a very important city under Akbar's time, and Ghori before that supposedly brought papermakers to Kalpi, and has been for hundreds of years a center for making paper and is referred to in many of the writings. And here you see sheets drying on the top left from a line, and below, this was in the 80s, those are gray because they use the soot from the chimney to color them, used for government folders. And on the right is just an illustration of how village life and craft live together. And I wanted to share with you some of the beautiful tools that are used for polishing paper. And this one is just one of the small hand tools used by an artist in Delhi whose lineage is in the Mughal court artisans. Beautiful tools. And I found throughout India, and unfortunately I don't have the room here to show picture after picture, but beautiful, beautiful tools that were used to create a smooth, polished surface on the paper for being perfect for calligraphy and for art. And so on the left, this is rather unusual, the ivory polisher from Ahmedabad area. And then these areas, the ones in the middle, the agate and other stone, were from Deccan area. And then on the top right, you see a woman, a Kagzi woman I met in Sialkot in Pakistan, who was showing me how her hands had been destroyed because as a young woman, she was the one who polished paper. And here's an example of the wooden support that they would lay the paper on and then use a tool going back and forth to polish that paper and help create the luminosity, but also to close the pores. And this brings up another thing. Going back to that picture of the papers drying on the wall, some of that lime and some of that finish on the wall may have helped to close the pores of the paper and add a sizing of sorts to it. And I wanted to show some of the variety of paper in India from different lineages and different heritages. And this is up in Binsar Forest, up in northern India. This is one of the foresters, and in his hand is some Daphne, and he's showing the tremendous strength of this fiber for making paper by the curve of it. And I had an anthropologist was leading me into these mountains, and they're really beautiful. And I saw, this was in my younger years when I didn't know as much as I do now about plants, and I saw a beautiful, beautiful circle of dark green plants that were about 6 foot tall, and they were in a circle in the forest. And I thought, wow, these are beautiful. And I went over to hug them before they could stop me, and it turns out they were stinging nettles. And for a week, I had such pain in my body. But anyway, just a recollection of the journey. And these are some of the scrolls, actually courtesy of Naveen Kumar, the astrological scrolls that have this kind of paper that I've named pundit paper, and that's just because I have been told repeatedly in the mountains that the pundits who did the astrological charts also very often made the paper for it, that this was not a sophisticated paper, at least in terms of the fibers. You can see all the clumpy fibers there and the wonderful character of this paper. The man on the left is showing how it was done in the villages, and this is most likely a grain chopper, but it just demonstrates what they used to do, which was to cook and then pound those fibers, and then the fibers would be put into some water, and then a sheet of cloth would be used as a support or a mat of sorts. You'll see in the next image of this on the left. Here is another image of one of those astrological scrolls, and they're so beautiful. I can't tell you the painted side. You see a little teeny bit of it there, but they're quite beautiful. But anyway, on the back, if you look closely, you can see that it has a kind of pattern that it may have been left to dry. The pulp may have been put onto some kind of mat or straw mat and left to dry and then peeled off. And here on the right is one of the astrologers from maybe Almora, somewhere in the mountains there, that showed me one of the larger charts that he had made. Okay, and then I wanted to show the difference in the Himalayan. So we have this style of paper that was part of the heritage from the paper makers in Muslim families, and that was right from China through Central Asia down into Kashmir and down into heartland India, Deccan, Jaipur, Delhi, Kalpi, all of those famous cities. But then we also had the root of paper coming in below the Himalayas and from China, and this other way of making paper. And here is just what you see in the high mountains there, where those sheets are laying on a cloth mold in the sun to dry. Just a beautiful sight. And here you see that Daphne, and there are some other fibers that are used in the mountains being gathered, and it's been washed, and it's been cooked, and it's a beautiful color too, that gold. And this is the nice colors of natural paper as a plant fiber paper, as opposed to, for example, the rag sheets, which are very often very white. These have a kind of golden luminosity to them. You see the women on the right, they're carrying the wood and through the paths, and this is all in Nepal. They are the little footpaths. It's quite wonderful. And on the left, they're cooking. They've got a little furnace going, and they're cooking the pulp, and it looks like brown mush. And here you see they are it's hand pounded, and it gets to be a consistency like mashed potatoes, sort of, a little bit stringier. And here it's the women as well as the men that make the paper. And she is squatting again, and she's floating a mold that is a wooden frame with a cloth background, and she's making her paper beautiful in uniform by using her hands to organize the fibers. Then she lifts up that mold and she supports it with a little wooden stake and allows that to dry right on the cloth mold in the sun. And what happens is the cloth acts as a restraint, just like the wall, and the back of that sheet is going to be smooth like a mirror, very, very beautifully smooth. And this area, this was in the very, very, very northern remote village in Nepal, and I don't know how I had the nerve to do this, but there were 2 Russian bush pilots who had a helicopter, and it was stripped down, and they were bringing concrete into the Himalayas. They had their tight jeans and aviator glasses, didn't speak in English, and they were smoking throughout the whole ride. Anyway, they gave me a ride into this high mountain area, and I got out of it eventually by a rescue. If someone had to be rescued, and there was a first aid helicopter that made a stop for me. But getting into this village, what was so wonderful and interesting about this is that, first of all, it was freezing, and I must say this was not in the winter. And the sheets would dry in the sun, but in the morning, when you'd get up, there would be these beautiful patterns, ice patterns on all of the papers. And I was told that the buyers for this paper were Buddhists in Japan who were buying them for spiritual texts because they felt they were particularly pure sheets. It was really a beautiful village, and I can tell you, sleeping at night there, you got over the cold on the outside of your body, but breathing in the cold air was like needles in your lungs. It was really, really hard, but a beautiful, beautiful place. And so you see the cloth molds drying in the sun. And I wanted to just add some of the wonderful variety of things made with paper, and this not so paper, but I was in Lahore at an old bookbindery, and this binder was repairing Qurans free of charge as his life mission. Anyway, they were showing me a lot of these old Qurans, and I had never seen, and all these conservators here I'm sure have seen this frequently, but this wonderful translucent sheet from the 1700s or from older times when there were no such things. And I was very intrigued. How was this made? What's going on here? How is this done? Trying to get to next slide. And so you can see on the left again that interleaving sheet, and they called it Huron K. Jili or Huron K. Nag if it was made from a snake. But on the right is a Jaipur artist who has these interleaving sheets that are much more crude. But these were used for tracing and for copying, and there's such a legacy of that for hundreds of years, and we'll look at that a little more. But how that paper, the translucent paper, is made from the membrane. It's really not paper, but we're just naming it that. It's made from the membrane between the skin and the flesh of an animal. They told me, the people that I learned the formula from told me it was made from deer, but other studies have shown that they've been made from goat as well. And I was also told that sometimes hunting scenes, in particular, they liked using the membrane from a black snake, the nag. I wanted to know how this was made, and the old bookbinder in Lahore told me there was somebody in Delhi that had made it at the turn of the century in the early 1900s, but he knew nothing else about it. So I got a translator, and I went to the old part of Delhi by the mosque, the Billy Moran, the old where the Muslim community lives, and kept asking. And finally, we found someone who actually, when he was 19, he was an older man when I interviewed him in the 80s, who had actually apprenticed with the man who made that paper, and that man was long gone. And in that part of Delhi, too, there had been fires. People left. It was a community that had a lot of migration and change. But in any event, he told me, this is how he explained it. He said that he was the neighbor of this guy, Munshi Nizar, who used to make this paper for bookbinders, and that eventually he learned how it was made. And he says that the entire skin of the deer was removed immediately while the blood was still warm, so that the membrane between the skin and the meat of the deer could be freed without breaking. The effort was guided by a sharp knife, and the membrane was stretched on a wooden frame, and it was allowed to dry, and then it was rubbed and coated with the liquid, and that liquid, secret liquid, and he says that was a combination of red tree sap, chana gund, or kikar gund, which is gum arabic, and that the mixture was kept 3 days, and when it became thick, salt was added at the time, and then it was used and allowed to dry. In any event, it's just an interesting sidestep in this kind of mysterious paper. All right, and so we're going to take a little teeny look at, and here we are connecting into the Deccan, the marbled masterpieces, internally marbled masterpieces that are attributed to the Deccan area, Hyderabad area, and Deccan. And I'm just going to throw a number out. This isn't exact, but maybe there's under 60 of these known in the world. It might be a little more, a little less, but they're very, very rare. And as far as we know, they are not common in other parts of the world, to say the least. Okay, this one is very interesting. This is just a close-up of a Sufi on one of these internally marbled images, but you see how the marbling pattern just creates the beauty in the image. And it was Christopher Weeman, an American, who first started showing how these were done with stencils. But I want to address that issue of stencil because we have such a history in India, and this is not just in modern times of making the copies and the forgeries and the fakes to sell to people that come by, but for the artists who wanted to work on various states and study changes in perspective and how they laid out an art. The use of stencil was age-old. It goes back many, many years, and actually there's a wonderful stencil in the Met's collection that's all pinpricks, and they would use a powder that would go through those pinprick holes, and it would help them position and play around with different states, sometimes for improving their art and sometimes for copying. So the use of stencil is really common, and I can see the next step in an artist having a bunch of stencils laying around their studio, and all of a sudden someone who is a marbler, lifting up one of those stencils and saying, let me see what happens when I use this stencil in marbling. And that wasn't done anywhere else. And on the right, by the way, is a stencil from Jaipur area. And these were the stencils that were used for the wall decorating. So, yeah. And these boards have strings on them, and the paper was pressed slightly onto those to create guides for calligraphy. And Yana reminded me that wasali, the whole issue of wasali in Indian paper and miniatures, and those boards are made of wasali, which is various sheets of handmade paper that have been glued and laminated together, and they're very, very strong, and this is what forms the substrate for things like this and for Mughal, some of the Mughal paintings. And on the right is an odd sheet I found. It's the reverse of what everyone does. This, they've used a stencil to block out an area that could be used for calligraphy. And I'm not even sure if calligraphy was on there and it faded or what, but maybe it was never used. But the marbling was done, and then there was a template laid above it while it was done so that the area of the paper remained white so that the calligrapher could write on it. It's just the opposite of what the artisans did in these works. And I have to first apologize. The quality of both of these images is far less than it should be. They're extraordinary images, and my photography is lax on this. But getting past that, let's look at the image on the left. And these are those internal marbled images, and you'll see a few of them in the Deccan exhibit. And again, they are rare of rare, 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 rare. The one on the left is very interesting because you see they've used they must have used multiple templates there and stencils, because there's so much going on, it's crazy. But you see in this animal, for example, how the lines of the marbling just go along with the body. And then this was also dipped into another type of marbling. I call it a moss pattern, but this is where instead of expanding, the pigment contracts and it creates this moss pattern. So this has got one heck of a lot going on. This man here, or the deer's jumping, the sacred site in the back, and all this is just incredibly complex and quite thrilling. But on the right, to me, this is much more magnificent because of the beautiful artistry of this marbled image. And my photograph doesn't show, but the muscles and the part of the animal's body is just accentuated by the marble pattern. And this was done by multiple stencils. And you can see, of course, these are added after decorated, but this is from the collection of Naveen Kumar, and there's another state similar in the India Office Library, which has now been just part of the British Library now, but this is just one of the most beautiful. It's just one of my favorites. Okay, and so how did they do this? Well, just briefly. Here's the tools they used. Those beautiful fenugreek seeds on the top are what form that viscous support so that the pigments could be floated and combed and manipulated and used to create wonderful images. And then these are the, it's the soapstone that's used to seal up the surface of the paper so that the pigments and all stay on it. And then you have the sap, the tree sap that's used to create the expansion or contraction. You have alum here. And then you have these wonderful earth pigments that are hand ground and used. And this is just a very primitive, marbling is much more complex than this, but this just shows you, and this is not on, this is actually on arrowroot, where he has dropped the pigments, combed them slightly, and then his hand pulling them with a reed. This is very unsophisticated, but at least you see something about it. And then a paper, of course, is set atop that and then lifted gently away, and the color stays on the paper if it's been prepared right and sized right. On the right side was also a primitive example of how the old masters marbled. They created combs, and they were much more, I think, fine than this. But these are thorns from the babool tree that he's used in a branch to create a comb that could be used to comb the patterns. And this is in the Deccan exhibit. This is when I went down to Hyderabad to Jagdish and Kamala Mittal's great collection. Anyway, this is a close-up, and you can see how the marbling just creates the pattern in her big fat body and the folds and all. And one of my colleagues mentioned that this was done by the same artist as another image in the Deccan exhibit. And for me, what I can see that confirms that is these kind of awkward beads around the neck and on her arm were done in a kind of silver that has tarnished to a gray. And that is the same finishing that's done on another image, and so it most likely was the same person. These are not, on the whole, there is one that's signed, but on the whole they're not. And I wanted to just add two other versions just very quickly. On the left from Afghanistan, you see a really loose marble, and on the right an extraordinary marble behind the calligraphy. And some of the end sheets, the beautiful combination of marbling with a decorative handwork. This is Turkish. Now it's totally out of this group, but I wanted to include it in because I'm just in love with the stylish was used to pull the pattern in to create these beautiful little flowers. I think this is in the Bini, I'm not sure. And just the beautiful artistry of the framing on this calligraphy is just superb. Okay, and the coloring of paper. I am not an expert in this, and there is quite an extraordinary here and there manuscripts that are vegetable dyed that have rose colors and lavender colors and very beautiful. But on the whole, let me show you a little bit, and this is courtesy of the Sackler. It's, again, not a great picture, but you can see on here that they're dipping sheets into a vat of color and they're letting them line dry, and on the right here is something the dyes are cooking. This happens to be a pretty interesting image because there's a wonderful little ledge here where everybody's shoes are. I guess they can't go into where the master is with shoes. And then they're further, the guy is getting his feet washed before he goes into that area. And then you see they're polishing paper, but right up here, this student must have not done well because his legs are being held up and the master's got a whip in his hand, and here's his backside. He's ready to get a beating. So I guess being an apprentice in those days might have been rough. Okay, and so coloring, the harital was another type of coloring that was frequently used in northern India, Nepal, along the Himalayan range there. And this was an arsenic sulfate that was used to coat the paper, and they're beautiful, beautiful tones of golden ochre. And the great advantage of that was that they're insecticide. They would prevent. And then this also, those dark blue that you see often in Tibetan, Nepali papers, they still use the arsenic, but they add lamp black, and some of these papers are so coated that they almost feel like leather. They're quite beautiful. And so this was a great preservation. I know I was in a library in I think it was near Ahmedabad. It was actually in Tonk. I was in a Muslim museum of Islamic manuscripts in Tonk, and there were thousands and thousands of early manuscripts. We are talking about early. And there were wall after wall of vellum bindings. And I went over to look at these beautiful white vellum bindings, and the whole wall became alive. There were thousands and thousands of silverfish that were eating these extraordinary manuscripts, and only one curator there and no one else really working. So in contrast, just an interesting side, I also went to one of the great Jain museums of manuscripts, and those manuscripts, each manuscript is hand cleaned and hand gone through once a year. And we're talking about thousands of manuscripts, so it's really a different, a very focused attention at preservation and care of those manuscripts. Interesting. All right, let's see, where are we going? And a few images of the, there are thousands of ways that paper in India was decorated and colored, and I love the gold sprinkled. And then I would be remiss if I didn't include at least one image, and this is only one, of the paper mache that was done in the Kashmir areas, and these extraordinary bindings. In the old, true paper mache, there are many layers of paper. Don't know if it's like Washley or not, but there was layers and layers of paper, and then they were, of course, lacquered and varnished and then painted on. Nowadays, it's just done on wood. It's not the same, but this is in the V&A. These bindings are extraordinary. And then paper was also used to, gunpowder was, or some kind of dynamite, was used to embed in the paper. And here's one of these structures. This is also from the Sackler, but in Massachusetts. And the structure is made with paper that is infused with gunpowder, and then, of course, in the celebration, it's lit. And again, I find that very often these, today on the right is a contemporary Hamid fireworks, that these also, this paper fireworks are very much kept in the Muslim family making tradition. The families, generations after generations, are doing similar things. Of course, the look changes. And you know how in the West there was always wearing the paper hat. Well, in the village too, the children are wearing the paper hat. And kites were another, and these are modern kites, but the old kites are quite extraordinary. There's a museum in Ahmedabad that just has the beautiful paper kites that were made in India. And so I want to close in giving thanks, especially to Mindy Dubansky and Jana Van Dyke for putting in the time to organize this, and to the Metropolitan Museum. And thanks to the Islamic Manuscript Association that is helping me digitize images that will be then made freely available through the University of Iowa. I have copies of my books there if anyone would like to buy them, and we're now open to questions.